Prince William's DNA test just dropped a royal bombshell, and King Charles isn't his father. For decades, Prince William was seen as the unquestioned heir to the British throne, polished, dutiful, and the very image of his father. But brand new, independently verified DNA results tell a shockingly different story. Sources confirm that the man raised to be king may have no blood claim to the crown at all. What does this mean for the monarchy? Who is William's real father? And why was this hidden for so long? This investigation exposes the truth buried deep behind palace walls, and the fallout could shake the royal line to its core. Pacific, golden light spilling across the immaculate lawn of a home that once symbolized liberation, a sanctuary far from the iron grip of royal tradition. But inside those walls, something darker was unfolding. Prince Harry stood frozen at the edge of his private office, clutching an envelope that weighed more than any crown ever could. The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of the envelope in his trembling hands. He hadn't opened it yet. He couldn't. Not yet. What lay inside had the power to undo everything he had ever known about himself. The man he had called father. The bloodline he had been raised to uphold. The monarchy he had once served, and the family he had walked away from. In that moment, as the breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus through the slightly ajar window, Harry realized this wasn't just about him. It was about the truth. About a secret that had been whispered for decades in corridors no one dared to record. About a mother's pain, a father's absence, and a truth the palace buried long ago. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, the question had hung in the air like the scent of an undetonated scandal. Was Prince Charles really Harry's biological father? The rumor had danced through tabloids and internet forums for decades, always dismissed, always denied. Too dangerous to touch, too volatile to test. Because if it were true, if Prince Harry was not, in fact, the biological son of King Charles III, then the very foundation of the royal succession was cracked. Not just politically, personally, intimately. Because for Harry, it wasn't about titles. It wasn't about privilege. It was about identity. It all began, as many modern tragedies do, with a legacy of silence. Diana Spencer was 19 when she was thrust into the royal spotlight. She married into a family where truth was a liability and image was everything. Her life was governed by protocols, restrictions, and carefully curated appearances. But beneath the designer gowns and radiant smiles was a young woman struggling. Struggling to be heard, to be seen, to be loved. Her marriage to Charles was, by her own admission, a loveless arrangement. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she famously said in her 1995 Panorama interview, referencing Charles's ongoing affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. But what the public didn't fully grasp then, what only a select few truly knew, was that Diana, too, found companionship elsewhere. And his name was James Hewitt. Major James Hewitt was a dashing, charismatic cavalry officer with chestnut hair, a charming grin, and a quiet confidence that starkly contrasted with the cold reserve of Prince Charles. Diana met him during a time when she was most vulnerable, trapped in a palace, emotionally abandoned, and constantly surveilled. Their affair lasted for 5 years. Not 5 weeks. Not 5 months. 5 years. Long enough for real emotion to blossom. Long enough for trust to form. Long enough for mistakes to happen. And here's where the timeline becomes uncomfortable. Prince Harry was born on September 15, 1984. Diana reportedly began her affair with Hewitt around 1986. That's what the official timeline says. But insiders, royal aides, ex-bodyguards, private secretaries have hinted otherwise. Some claim the relationship began as early as 1983. Others say they witnessed interactions that suggested the bond was deeper and more personal than anyone acknowledged publicly. For decades, the palace's strategy was simple: deny, discredit, distract. Keep the public eye fixed on tradition. Keep the scandal buried. But DNA doesn't lie. And it was Meghan Markle, insiders now say, who finally pushed for the truth. Meghan had never been accepted by the British establishment. From the moment she entered Harry's life, she was branded an outsider. American. Divorced. Biracial. Opinionated. She disrupted the status quo, and the monarchy despised her for it. But it was precisely that outsider's instinct that drove her to question things Harry had always accepted without doubt. And one of those things was the persistent, unsettling rumor that her husband's paternity might not be what he believed. At first, Harry was resistant. Understandably so. The thought of not being Charles's son, of not belonging in the House of Windsor, was too much. It was destabilizing. He clung to the official story. But over time, as family tensions grew, and his relationship with his father frayed further, something began to shift. There were looks exchanged at royal functions, awkward pauses during speeches, and one comment from Charles that Harry reportedly never forgot: "You're not like your brother. You never were." That was the moment the seed took root. And once it was planted, it couldn't be ignored. They began quietly. Ancestry research. Genealogical labs in California. Discreet phone calls made through third-party intermediaries. Hair samples collected from old brushes. A legal firm retained in secret. Everything was done with utmost caution, because this wasn't just about solving a personal mystery. This was about uncovering a royal deception that had been maintained for nearly 4 decades. And now, on this morning in Montecito, the answer was inside that envelope. Let's pause for a moment here, not because we need suspense, but because you need to understand the stakes. If the DNA results confirmed that James Hewitt was Harry's biological father, then everything changes. Not just for the monarchy, not just for Britain, but for Harry. Because identity is not just about blood. It's about memory, family, loyalty, and betrayal. To find out that the man who raised you, disciplined you, shaped you, was not, in fact, your father? That's a reckoning most people never face. But Harry did. He finally opened the envelope. Slowly, methodically. Meghan stood nearby, silent, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Their children were upstairs, unaware that the trajectory of their lives was about to shift forever. Harry read the report once, then twice, then a third time. Each time, his face grew paler, his breath shallower. And finally, he said, barely above a whisper, "It's true." That's where the story truly begins. Because what do you do with the truth when it shatters everything you thought you knew? Do you bury it? Do you broadcast it? Do you forgive the lies that kept it hidden? Or do you burn it all down and start again? In this video, we're going to walk you through everything from the early signs Diana tried to leave behind, to the forbidden romance with James Hewitt, to the tightly guarded secrets of the palace, and the steps Prince Harry took to confirm the truth for himself. We'll hear from insiders, investigators, close friends, and yes, even James Hewitt himself. But most importantly, we'll follow the emotional journey of a man torn between the legacy he was born into and the truth that redefines him. A man who once wore the crown's uniform, but now finds himself asking, was it ever really mine to wear? You won't want to miss a second of what's coming. The late Princess Diana remains one of the most enigmatic, beloved, and complex figures in modern royal history. But perhaps the greatest mystery she left behind wasn't her tragic death. It was the legacy of secrets she tried to pass on in whispers, looks, and handwritten letters that only a few ever saw. Among those secrets, one possibility loomed darker than the rest, that her second son, Prince Harry, might not be the biological child of Prince Charles. Diana never said those words directly, not in public. But she didn't have to. Her life was one long coded warning, and this chapter begins with her most dangerous confession. The truth didn't come out in a press conference. It wasn't shouted from a palace balcony. It was a slow unraveling, a soft rebellion waged through glances, silences, and half-spoken truths shared with confidants who would only later realize their full weight. It started with the letters. There are dozens of letters and diary entries attributed to Diana, some verified, others disputed, but one in particular has stirred unease in the years since it was quietly leaked to the press in the late 2000s. In it, Diana wrote to her former butler and trusted friend, Paul Burrell. The language was cryptic but unmistakable. She described being watched, knowing too much, and warned that they will do anything to protect the line. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. The entire letter oozed with foreboding, a sense of something unspeakable being held just beneath the surface. And in one line, nearly overlooked, she wrote, "I hope my sons find the truth when they are older. About everything." At the time, this line was dismissed as paranoia, the musings of a woman under stress. But now, it's being looked at in an entirely new light. What truth was Diana referring to? Her mistreatment by the firm? The affair between Charles and Camilla? Or was it something deeper, something that had to do with Harry's very bloodline? To understand why this line matters, we have to revisit the years leading up to it. In the mid-1980s, Diana was spiraling. Her marriage to Charles was disintegrating in full view of the palace staff. She was isolated, emotionally neglected, and deeply mistrustful of nearly everyone around her. The royal courtiers considered her unstable, but friends saw something different. A woman desperate for real human connection in a world that demanded robotic compliance. And then she met James Hewitt. James Hewitt was everything Charles wasn't. Athletic, charming, attentive. Where Charles buried himself in dusty royal duties and Camilla's company, Hewitt offered Diana companionship, laughter, and most importantly, validation. He made her feel seen. Their relationship quickly turned intimate, and it endured far longer than the royal family was ever willing to admit. The official timeline says they became involved in 1986. But people close to Diana insist it was earlier, possibly as early as 1983. That's a crucial detail, because Prince Harry was born in September 1984. There's no denying Harry and Hewitt bear a striking resemblance. The red hair, the facial structure, the mannerisms. It became a source of cruel jokes in the press and persistent whispers in aristocratic circles. For Diana, this was a nightmare. She knew what the rumors would mean, not just for Harry, but for her own survival within the system. That's why she buried the truth, not with lies, but with silence. Still, silence is never perfect. And Diana, whether consciously or subconsciously, left a trail. Interviews, handwritten notes, conversations with trusted allies. In one recorded moment with close friend Simone Simmons, Diana reportedly admitted she feared Harry would one day ask questions she couldn't answer. He's not like William, she allegedly said. He's softer, kinder, more curious. He's going to want to know why everything feels different. And indeed, Harry did feel different. Even in his earliest years, Harry's relationship with Charles was awkward at best. Charles, ever the traditionalist, gravitated toward William, the heir, the model royal. Harry, on the other hand, was the spare, often left to his own devices. There are photographs from the boy's early childhood where Charles is seen doting on William while Harry looks on, sometimes smiling, sometimes not. In one famous clip, when asked by a reporter about Harry's birth, Charles says dryly, "Wonderful. Another boy. And he even has red hair." It was a throwaway comment, meant to be humorous. But for those who understand the dynamics of the royal family, it carried an undercurrent of discomfort. Almost as if Charles was subtly disowning his youngest son, distancing himself from the obvious resemblance to another man. Inside the palace, the staff weren't blind. Whispered jokes circulated among footmen and aides. Harry was referred to never in his presence, but always with a smirk, as the major's boy. It was cruel, but it was persistent, and Diana knew it. This is perhaps why she grew increasingly protective of Harry as he got older. In public, she held his hand a little tighter, laughed more genuinely in his presence, looked at him with an intensity that suggested more than just maternal love. It was almost guilt, as if she knew she had brought him into a world that would never accept him fully, that if the truth ever emerged, they would tear him apart. Paul Burrell, who served Diana with unwavering loyalty, once said in an interview that Harry was Diana's anchor, that he grounded her, that he reminded her of something unfiltered and good. He also hinted, carefully, cautiously, that Diana confided things in him she never shared with anyone else. And while he never confirmed the rumors about Harry's paternity, he did say this: there are truths that would destroy the image of the monarchy. Diana knew some of them, and she tried to leave behind a trail so her boys wouldn't have to live in the dark forever. What's remarkable is that Harry didn't pursue this trail for decades. Not until much later in life, when his world began to unravel in other ways. His wife attacked by the press, his relationship with his father strained to the point of silence, and his mental health deteriorating under the weight of expectation and unresolved grief. That's when the whispers from the past became louder, and Diana's dangerous confession, once just a vague shadow, began to take form. James Hewitt, for his part, has always denied being Harry's father. In interviews, he has claimed the timing doesn't add up, that he and Diana were involved after Harry's birth. But there's a strange discomfort in his denials, too rehearsed, too defensive. When pressed, he often deflects, saying he doesn't want to cause Harry any more pain. And yet, he's never allowed a conclusive DNA test. Why? Some speculate he signed an agreement, hushed money from the palace. Others believe he's protecting Harry, or himself, or both. Because if he were to confirm the paternity, the implications wouldn't just be personal, they would be constitutional. What happens to Harry's titles? His place in the line of succession? His status in royal history? It's a labyrinth of consequences, one that Diana tried to navigate with only instinct and heart. She didn't have the legal tools. She didn't have the backing of the firm. All she had was her voice, her intuition, and a fierce desire to protect her sons. In the end, that's what this confession was really about, not destroying the monarchy, but freeing her children from the lies that bound them. Diana was no revolutionary, but she was a mother. And sometimes, that's more dangerous than any rebel. Because mothers remember everything. And they carry secrets not in vaults, but in their hearts, where no one can erase them. This is where the deeper tragedy begins. Because Diana didn't live to see the moment when Harry would finally ask the question she feared most. She died when he was just 12, young enough to believe in fairy tales, but old enough to sense that something wasn't right. That question would stay buried for decades, locked behind trauma and protocol. But as we now know, it was never going to stay buried forever. James Hewitt was never meant to become a historical figure. He didn't come from royalty, didn't hold a title, didn't command armies or headlines, at least not at first. He was simply a military man, trained in honor, bred for discipline, and quietly content with his role in Her Majesty's Armed Forces. But fate had other plans. And so did Diana, Princess of Wales. When James Hewitt met Diana, it wasn't in a gilded ballroom or at a formal state function. It was in a setting that couldn't have been more ordinary, a riding lesson. Diana wanted to improve her equestrian skills, and Hewitt, an accomplished cavalry officer in the Household Cavalry, was assigned to help. The year was officially said to be 1986, but as history continues to be re-examined, that timeline has started to look suspiciously like palace-approved fiction. Their connection was immediate. According to close sources, Diana was lonely, emotionally neglected, and increasingly at odds with Prince Charles, whose affections had never truly been hers. Charles, emotionally distant and forever tangled in the gravitational pull of Camilla Parker Bowles, had long checked out of their marriage. Diana, meanwhile, was drowning, pressured to perform as the perfect princess, yet isolated in a palace filled with eyes but void of warmth. James Hewitt was a break in that storm. He was kind, attentive, and most importantly, safe, at least at first. What began as casual conversation over bridles and saddles quickly evolved into something more intimate. Diana, known for her candidness in private, once described Hewitt as the first man who made her feel emotionally safe since her marriage. According to her longtime confidant Simone Simmons, Diana admitted, "I was in love with him. Deeply. He was everything Charles wasn't." Hewitt didn't seek attention. In fact, he actively avoided it. That was part of his appeal. While other men Diana had encountered either wanted a piece of her fame or were intimidated by it, Hewitt treated her like a person. She could cry in front of him, speak without filtering, and laugh without caution. The emotional vulnerability she showed around him was reportedly profound. In letters later auctioned off, some sold for staggering amounts, Diana's handwritten notes to Hewitt revealed not just affection, but longing. She missed him. She trusted him. She confided in him. But the question that continues to haunt this relationship is not about love. It's about biology. The timeline is critical. If Diana and Hewitt began their affair in 1986, as the official narrative claims, then Prince Harry's birth in 1984 would make it biologically impossible for Hewitt to be his father. But evidence and multiple sources suggest their bond started earlier. As early as 1983, Diana was reportedly growing closer to the cavalry officer, despite heavy scrutiny. There are no hard documents to confirm this. But there are eyewitness accounts, former palace employees, and aides who have alluded to interactions between Diana and Hewitt that predate the 1986 milestone. The resemblance between James Hewitt and Prince Harry has long been the center of media speculation, and not without merit. They share not just red hair, but similar jawlines, nose structures, and facial expressions. The resemblance became so widely discussed that at one point, British tabloids ran side-by-side photo comparisons, practically inviting the public to decide for themselves. Royal biographers have always been quick to dismiss these comparisons as coincidental, pointing to the Spencer family's natural redhead gene. But the public was never convinced. And neither, as it turns. In later years, Prince Harry himself made remarks that hinted at his discomfort with the comparison. In one reported incident, during a tense argument with Charles, Harry is said to have shouted, "At least I'm not the one cheating." A stinging line, but also a reflection of the pressure Harry felt as rumors swirled, and his own place in the royal family seemed increasingly uncertain. It was as if he knew he was different, and not just because of his choices, but because of something deeper, something he couldn't name. Not yet. For James Hewitt, the situation was equally complicated. As his name became synonymous with scandal, his life unraveled. He was vilified in the press, labeled a traitor, and seen as a disgrace to the military. Friends say the pressure broke him. His military career never fully recovered. His private life collapsed. He spiraled into debt, struggled with health issues, and suffered a mental breakdown. At one point, he attempted to take his own life. The burden of carrying a truth, or a lie, so heavily guarded by the crown became too much to bear. Still, he remained silent about the one question everyone wanted answered. Was he Prince Harry's biological father? Over the years, journalists tried to corner him. Tabloids offered vast sums for exclusive interviews. Books were written. TV specials aired. Yet Hewitt continued to deny paternity. In one interview, when asked directly if he could be Harry's father, Hewitt simply responded, "No, I'm not. I can understand the interest, but it's not true." The tone, however, was evasive, not indignant, not firm. There was always an edge of something unsaid, something protected. Why would he lie? One theory is that he had signed a legal agreement, possibly with the crown, to keep silent in exchange for financial compensation or protection. Another is more personal, that he didn't want to destroy what little peace Harry had left. If the truth were confirmed, the fallout wouldn't just affect Charles or the monarchy, it would impact Harry's identity, his children, his marriage, his legacy. And that, perhaps, was a weight Hewitt chose not to place on his shoulders. But the truth, even when buried, has a way of surfacing. And with the advancement of genetic testing and DNA analysis, secrets that once could be silenced by denial are now laid bare by science. For years, James Hewitt was mocked, discarded, and written off as a footnote in royal history. A passing scandal. A distraction. But the story is far more complex than tabloids ever captured. Hewitt wasn't just a lover. He was a man who offered Diana something the royal family never did: unconditional emotional support. And in return, Diana gave him her trust, her affection, and perhaps, just perhaps, something more. In private, those who knew Hewitt describe him as tormented by the rumors. A man unsure whether his love was a gift or a curse. A man who once walked hand in hand with the future Princess of Wales, only to spend the rest of his life wondering if the boy she loved most carried his blood. It's easy. Within the grand walls of the British monarchy, some truths are kept so carefully guarded that even time struggles to uncover them. Files are classified. Letters are hidden. Access is restricted not for national security, but for reputational preservation. And one of the most protected secrets in all of Windsor history is not a political treaty or a state decision. It is the paternity of Prince Harry. At the center of this web lies a question that has echoed for decades, yet was never definitively answered. Who is Harry's biological father? And more importantly, why did it take nearly 40 years for science to be allowed anywhere near the answer? For a family that prides itself on tradition, control has always been paramount. Every handshake, every photograph, every sentence spoken in public is choreographed with precision. But the real control lies deeper, in the information that never makes it past the palace gates. Medical files, birth certificates, personal records. These are the tools the firm uses to maintain its grip on public perception. And in Harry's case, those tools were weaponized not just to uphold his identity, but possibly to hide it. Let's start with what's publicly known. When Harry was born in 1984, the announcement was swift and grand. The Princess of Wales has given birth to a healthy baby boy, the headlines read. Photographs followed quickly, Diana in a red coat, cradling her newborn son beside Prince Charles on the steps of St. Mary's Hospital. The image was iconic. The message was clear. The line of succession was secure. But behind the scenes, there were whispers almost immediately. Midwives reportedly commented on the infant's unusual coloring. Some royal aides, speaking years later under anonymity, claimed that Charles himself made an offhand comment about Harry's red hair, drawing parallels not to the Windsors, but to someone else entirely. Whether meant as a joke or something more pointed, the remark left an impression. It planted the seed. By the late 1990s, conspiracy theories about Harry's paternity had become so rampant that even Buckingham Palace felt compelled to address them, albeit indirectly. Royal biographers loyal to the crown began to subtly reshape the narrative. Books were published explaining that Diana's relationship with James Hewitt began years after Harry's birth. Genetic experts were quietly quoted in interviews claiming the red hair came from Diana's family line. The official word was that the question had been debunked. But the question remained. Why had no one in the royal family ever agreed to a DNA test? Because testing the bloodline wasn't just a personal issue, it was a constitutional one. If it were ever proven that Harry was not the biological son of Charles, the entire royal succession would face scrutiny. Even though Harry was never next in line to the throne, always the spare, as he once described himself, his legitimacy still mattered. It mattered to the public, to the institution, and to the image of the monarchy as a stable, unbroken lineage. And so, over the years, layers of protection were built around the royal DNA. Access to Harry's medical records was virtually impossible. Any samples that could be used for testing, hairbrushes, clothing, even drinking glasses, were reportedly destroyed or controlled by palace staff. When rumors swirled that journalists were trying to obtain DNA from objects used by Harry or Charles, lawsuits were quietly threatened. Security was increased. One private investigator, who spoke on condition of anonymity, claimed that attempts to collect DNA samples from a hotel towel used by Charles in the late 1990s were thwarted by palace security within hours. "They monitor everything," he said, "and they shut it down the second it gets too close." But the rise of technology and the crumbling of royal relationships changed everything. When Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal duties in 2020, the shift was more than symbolic. It gave them legal and physical distance from the crown. In Montecito, they were no longer under palace surveillance. Their staff was loyal to them, not to the firm. And most importantly, their environment became controllable. For the first time in Harry's life, he was in a position to seek the truth on his terms. But he didn't jump at the chance. According to sources close to the couple, the idea of DNA testing was something Meghan had floated several times, especially after seeing the toll the ongoing speculation took on Harry. He would brush it off, or laugh it away, or change the subject. But inside, it gnawed at him. His identity was crumbling in slow motion. Every headline about Hewitt's son, every photo comparison, every awkward silence between him and Charles added to the weight. Then came the turning point. During a heated conversation with his father, reportedly over royal titles and financial support for his children, Charles allegedly said something that left Harry stunned. The exact words have never been made public, but one insider recalled Charles ending the conversation with, "You've always known you were different." It was meant as a reprimand, but Harry took it as confirmation. That night, he agreed. It was time to find out. They contacted a private DNA consultancy firm based in Los Angeles, one specializing in high-profile, confidential paternity cases. This wasn't some off-the-shelf ancestry test. It was a deeply encrypted, multi-phase process that would compare Harry's DNA to both Charles and James Hewitt using indirect samples and confirmed genealogical markers. Hair strands, tissue samples, and documented ancestral matches were all part of the investigation. But here's where it gets complicated. Charles, of course, would never submit his DNA willingly. Nor would the palace allow any of his known records to be accessed. So the investigators had to work with what they could gather, archival tissue from historical blood donations Charles had made in the past, combined with genetic material from close relatives. They triangulated data from Queen Elizabeth's line, from Prince Philip's known genetics, and from other Windsors. On the other side, they had confirmed DNA from James Hewitt, extracted years ago and secured in medical and legal archives related to his public breakdown and hospitalizations. The process took months. Every week, Harry would ask if the results were in. And every week, he would hear the same answer, "Not yet." He tried to distract himself with work, with his children, with media obligations. But the question haunted him. What would it mean if the results came back positive? What would it mean if they came back negative? Either way, the outcome would shift something fundamental, something permanent. And then one morning, the envelope arrived. Unmarked, hand-delivered, silent. At this stage, there was no turning back. The man who had once served in Afghanistan, who had stood at his mother's funeral with a blank, tearless stare, who had watched his wife be shredded by the British press. Now he stood in his own home, staring down the truth he had been denied his entire life. The royal family's desperate attempt to bury the question of DNA had worked for decades. It had silenced journalists. It had scared off investigators. It had protected the illusion of lineage. But science is indifferent to illusions. And now, as Harry prepared to read the findings, it became clear the monarchy could no longer outrun the truth. The DNA tests were complete. The analysis was verified. The conclusion was final. What the royal institution had locked away for nearly 40 years had finally been unlocked, not by scandal, not by press, but by a son's need to know who he truly was. Long before any DNA results were delivered, before any letters were opened or labs contacted, the truth was already whispering in the back of Prince Harry's mind. It was never loud, never aggressive. It crept in during quiet moments, after an argument with Charles, after reading a tabloid headline, after noticing how different he looked beside William. It wasn't a single revelation. It was a slow erosion, a quiet unraveling of certainty that started in childhood and grew louder as the years passed. The earliest memories Harry recalls, according to friends, were not of comfort and connection with his father, but of confusion. Prince Charles, ever formal, ever composed, was never emotionally available, not to William, and certainly not to Harry. But for William, the dynamic had always been different. He was the heir, the chosen one, the child who would inherit not just the crown, but the responsibility of holding the monarchy together. Harry was the spare. That phrase, the spare, was more than just an informal title. It was an identity imposed upon him, repeated in jest by the media, reinforced by the family hierarchy, and etched into every public event he ever attended. William led. Harry followed. William was consulted. Harry was informed. William was praised. Harry was scrutinized. And Harry felt it. He was always told to behave, to conform, to smile when spoken to. But as he got older, he began to see that no matter how much he complied, he would never be viewed as equal, not by his family, not by the courtiers, not by the public. What began as feelings of inadequacy soon gave way to something sharper, alienation. Harry began to notice things. The way Charles looked at William, with a mix of pride and expectation. The way he spoke to Harry, with formality, distance, and occasional irritation. Charles wasn't cruel. He wasn't overtly abusive. But there was a void, a disconnect that no amount of royal protocol could hide. One incident stands out in Harry's memory. He was 10 years old. It was a charity event, one of many public appearances he and William attended with their parents. That day, the press had made a fuss about William's poise, his handshake, his polite smile. Charles had leaned down and told William, "One day you'll make a fine king." And then he turned to Harry and said, "And you'll make a fine brother." It was meant as a compliment. But to Harry, it felt like a dismissal, a reminder of his secondary status. And yet, the deeper doubt didn't set in until adolescence, when the rumors began to follow him like shadows. The British tabloids were relentless. They printed comparisons between him and James Hewitt. They showcased old photos of the cavalry officer beside snapshots of young Harry, practically daring readers to spot the differences or lack thereof. At school, classmates whispered. Even teachers, though discreet, couldn't hide their curiosity. And while most would have shrugged off the speculation as cruel gossip, Harry internalized it. He'd stare at himself in the mirror, searching his face for answers. His red hair, his sharp jaw, his cheekbones. None of it looked like Charles. None of it looked like William. One time, in his late teens, Harry confronted his mother's old friend about the rumors. He asked bluntly, "Do you think it's true?" The friend refused to answer. She changed the subject. But the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Then came the distance with his father. After Diana's death, Charles tried, at least on the surface, to be a more present figure in Harry's life. But his efforts were clumsy, often overshadowed by duty. For Charles, everything came second to the crown, even his sons. And Harry, still grieving his mother, felt increasingly abandoned. He would later describe himself as a young man filled with rage. Rage at the press. Rage at the institution. Rage at the silence that surrounded his mother's death. But beneath that anger was something deeper, something quieter. A sense that he didn't belong. Not truly. Not completely. When Meghan came into his life, she became the first person to articulate what Harry had long felt but couldn't explain. She told him, "You're not like them. You never were." At first, he thought she was talking about personality, his openness, his informality, his willingness to challenge the system. But over time, their conversations dug deeper. Meghan started asking questions that no one else had dared to ask him. Why do you think your father treats you differently? Why do they protect William but not you? Have you ever considered that maybe it's not just about hierarchy? At first, Harry brushed it off. The idea was too destabilizing, too dangerous. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The offhand comments from Charles. The awkward silences from palace staff when the subject came up. The guarded reactions from William any time the topic of James Hewitt was broached. Even the Queen, who had always maintained a tight grip on protocol, once gave Harry a look, just a glance, after he cracked a joke about being the ginger stepchild of the Windsors. She didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She simply looked away. It was all circumstantial. Hints, whispers, good feelings. But they began to add up. And as the media pressure mounted, as the public continued to hound Meghan and dissect every detail of their marriage, Harry found himself asking, who am I defending? What am I protecting? And more urgently, why do I feel like I'm fighting for a family that never truly embraced me? The final push came during one of the last meetings he had with his father before the official royal exit. They were discussing logistics, titles, funding, security. Charles was cold, dismissive. He accused Harry of being reckless, ungrateful, impulsive. The conversation turned sour quickly, and at one point, Harry demanded, "Why do you always treat me like an outsider?" Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't explode. He simply said, "Because sometimes I wonder if you see yourself as one." That line broke something in Harry, because in it, he heard not just anger, but avoidance. As if Charles was hinting at something he couldn't say outright, or wouldn't. When Harry walked out of that room, Meghan was waiting for him. He looked at her, his expression blank. She asked, "What happened?" He said, "I think I need to know." And that's how the journey toward the truth really began, not with a test tube or a laboratory, but with the echo of a lifetime of doubt finally reaching a volume he could no longer ignore. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival. Because the question wasn't just about blood. It was about peace. And Harry couldn't have peace until he knew, finally, and irrevocably, whether the man who raised him was truly his father. Once the decision was made, there was no turning back. It wasn't the kind of choice one could forget about or leave for later. Once Prince Harry admitted to himself that he needed to know the truth, the question began burning inside him. It flared in his chest when he looked at his children. It pulsed in his thoughts during interviews and speeches. And every time a news outlet ran another comparison photo between him and James Hewitt, every time a commentator casually tossed out the phrase, "Hewitt's son," it fueled a need he could no longer suppress. But how do you investigate the bloodline of royalty when the system guarding it is one of the most impenetrable in the world? How do you extract DNA without triggering alarms, lawsuits, or a tabloid feeding frenzy? Harry knew the answer had to be found discreetly, quietly, methodically. And it had to start with trust, because one wrong move could not only shatter his own life but also put Meghan and their children at risk. The first step was to assemble a team, one that would operate outside the press, outside the palace, outside anything with the stench of the monarchy's reach. Meghan, ever resourceful, reached out to a network of discreet experts in California. Not just DNA analysts, but privacy lawyers, former intelligence operatives, and forensic genealogists. These weren't people you'd find in the phone book or on a public website. These were specialists, people who had worked with celebrities, CEOs, and victims of long-standing family secrets. They were given code names. Phone calls were encrypted. Meetings happened in private residences, never the same location twice. Paper trails were avoided. Nothing was to be stored digitally without two-factor encryption. And everyone involved was required to sign ironclad non-disclosure agreements that extended not just to the media, but to friends, spouses, and colleagues. If word got out before the results were in, the investigation would be discredited before it began. The firm chosen to carry out the analysis was a boutique lab based in Palo Alto, known not for its advertisements, but for its reputation among the ultra-wealthy. They had conducted high-stakes paternity investigations for billionaire families and were accustomed to operating in total secrecy. The head of the lab, a stoic geneticist with over 20 years of experience, agreed to take the case personally. But there was a problem. DNA testing requires samples, uncontaminated, verified samples. Harry could provide his own easily, of course. But what about the other two men? Getting a DNA sample from James Hewitt was tricky, but not impossible. Fortunately, because of his hospital stays and health issues over the years, Hewitt's genetic data was already on file in multiple facilities. One of these facilities, in Spain, held a preserved sample from a biopsy he had undergone a few years prior. Through a series of third-party legal maneuvers and confidential requests, a copy of that genetic material was obtained for comparison. The Charles side of the equation, however, was far more complicated. Prince Charles, or now King Charles III, was not about to submit DNA to any lab, especially one linked to Harry. That door was firmly closed. But the investigators were not without options. Charles had donated blood publicly in the 1990s, and that sample, though stored and coded, was still preserved under tight security at a London-based research institution. The investigative team knew that breaking in or stealing the sample would be illegal and catastrophic, so they found a workaround. Using publicly available genetic markers from extended royal family members, including known DNA data from Prince Philip and distant Windsor cousins, they constructed a profile that could serve as a highly accurate proxy for Charles's own genetic code. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough for a comparative analysis, especially when layered with biometric traits, facial structure algorithms, and mitochondrial markers from Queen Elizabeth's known maternal line. The result, a statistically verified royal genetic profile with a high confidence margin. When the lab received all three components, Harry's DNA, Hewitt's certified genetic material, and the Windsor composite, the testing began. The process was complex, involving over 24 rounds of analysis. This wasn't a yes or no answer. It was a forensic dive into patterns, chromosomal sequencing, and inherited mutations. The results wouldn't just reveal paternity, they would tell a story. They would map Harry's heritage down to the smallest strand of truth. For weeks, Harry and Meghan waited. The lab gave no progress updates, no commentary, no leaks. It was absolute silence. Harry tried to carry on with life as normal, but nothing felt normal. Not the mornings with Archie and Lilibet. Not the interviews. Not even the laughter that used to come so easily with Meghan. There was always a shadow, an invisible weight hanging in the air between moments. A pressure that deepened each time a phone buzzed or a knock came at the door. And then one evening, the call came. Not a voice. Just a message. The package is ready. Arriving tomorrow morning. Hand delivery. Harry didn't sleep that night. He walked the hallways of his Montecito home, replaying memories in his mind. His first rugby match. The day he met Meghan. The time Charles took him to Balmoral and said, "This is your legacy." Was it? Had it ever been? He thought of his mother. How she used to stroke his hair when he cried. How she used to say, "Don't let them turn you into one of them." He didn't understand it then. He did now. The morning was quiet. Overcast. Cool for California. A black car pulled up the long driveway just after 8 a.m. A woman in a gray suit stepped out, holding a small silver case. No greetings. No ceremony. Just a nod and a signature. Harry took the case, heart pounding, and stepped inside. Meghan was already there, waiting. She didn't say a word. Neither did he. He placed the case on the kitchen island, opened the latch, and pulled out a thick, white envelope marked only with one word: results. It felt heavier than it should have, like it had absorbed all the gravity in the room. Harry's hands shook as he broke the seal. His eyes scanned the page, then stopped. The summary was clear, clean, unambiguous. The results indicated, with 99.998% certainty, that James Hewitt was the biological father of Prince Harry. No margin of error. No chance of coincidence. No doubts. Harry stared at the words for a full minute. He didn't speak. Meghan touched his arm, but he didn't move. His breathing was slow, his eyes dry. He just stood there, frozen in time, suspended between the life he had known and the truth that now stood before him. It wasn't anger that came next. It wasn't sadness. It was silence. A long, heavy silence that stretched across the room like fog. Meghan finally whispered, "It's done." But Harry didn't respond. Because in that moment, everything shifted. The palace, the press, the public, all of it was noise. What mattered was that the question was finally answered. The private investigation was complete. The truth was in his hands. And nothing would ever be the same again. The moment the truth physically entered the room, it was unassuming. No sirens, no sudden shifts in light, no cosmic revelation from above. Just a simple manila envelope, slightly worn at the edges, tucked neatly into a sleek, nondescript case. Delivered quietly, handed over without words. The kind of moment that history forgets, but which tears a person's identity in two. Harry had been preparing for it, or so he thought. He had paced for hours the night before. He had rehearsed in his head what it might feel like, what he might say. He had even fantasized about reading the result and laughing, relieved that the world had been wrong and Charles was, indeed, his biological father. But as he broke the seal and unfolded the document inside, he felt none of the imagined confidence. No jokes, no rush of clarity, just a breath that wouldn't come, and a stillness that felt like drowning. The top of the report was clinical, almost emotionless. A series of numbers, identifiers, codes. Nothing dramatic. Just scientific language, as sterile and objective as the test itself. But the line that mattered was clear. Simple. Brutal. Based on the DNA analysis conducted using STR markers and genealogical comparison data, the individual identified as Prince Harry shows a 99.998% probability of biological paternity with James Lifford Hewitt. That was it. A fact. One sentence. Harry read it 3 times, just to be certain. His eyes moved mechanically across the words, but his mind felt detached, numb. The page could have said anything. He felt like an observer watching someone else's tragedy unfold. Megan reached for the report, scanning it herself in quiet horror. Her face paled, her lips parted in disbelief, but she said nothing. The silence between them was thick. Not uncomfortable, just unshakable. What was there to say? No amount of talking could process the implication of what they had just read. The man who had raised Harry, who had disciplined him, who had stood with him on state balconies, who had appeared in family portraits and documentaries and public speeches, that man was not his biological father. The line was broken. The story was a lie. For Harry, the realization struck like a slow-motion train crash. Not all at once, but in waves. He thought of his mother, Diana. The way she held him tighter than she held William. The way she smiled at him with a kind of melancholic pride, as if she knew something that he didn't. He thought of her famous interviews, her cryptic references to protecting her children from a system she didn't trust. Was this what she meant? Was this the secret she carried to her grave? He also thought of James Hewitt, the man he'd only met a few times in passing, someone who was never acknowledged by the family, someone Harry had grown up knowing only through scandalous headlines and sarcastic jokes. To now know that man shared his blood, it was disorienting, like discovering that your reflection in the mirror had belonged to someone else all along. And then there was Charles. It would have been easier if Charles had been cruel, if he had been openly abusive, dismissive, or absent. But the truth was more complicated. Charles had been there. Not consistently, not perfectly, but he had been a presence. He had taken Harry to Africa. He had spoken at his school. He had walked behind Diana's coffin with him, side by side, united in grief. He had shown moments of affection now. Awkward, yes, but real. And now Harry had to process the truth that all those memories were not with his father, but with a man who had known, perhaps for years, that they didn't share blood. This wasn't just a scientific revelation. It was an emotional bomb. It detonated everything. The family dynamic, the childhood memories, the sense of place, of belonging, of identity. And there was no protocol for how to grieve a lie. After several minutes of silence, Harry finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, fragile, like a boy lost in the woods. So, it's true. Megan nodded gently, eyes wide with emotion. Yes. Harry lowered the report and placed it on the table. He looked out the window. The California sun was rising, illuminating the garden. It looked just like every other morning. Birds chirped. The trees rustled. But inside, his world was in freefall. He sat down slowly, hands shaking, and buried his face in them. Did he know? He asked, barely above a whisper. Megan hesitated. Charles. Harry nodded. Megan exhaled slowly, choosing her words carefully. I think. He always suspected. Maybe even knew. But he never wanted to face it. Denial is easier. Harry's mind raced back to the last few years. The increasing tension. The passive-aggressive remarks. The financial restrictions. The refusal to grant titles to Archie and Lilibet. It all started to make sense. It wasn't just about Megan. It wasn't just about the media. It was about blood. Charles had known. Or believed, and he had acted accordingly. But now the proof was here. The envelope that once weighed so heavily in his hands now sat still on the table, its contents exposed, its truth irrevocable. There was no going back. Later that day, after the initial shock had dulled just slightly, Harry did something unexpected. He took a walk. Alone. No security. No phone. Just his thoughts. He wandered the winding roads of Montecito, wearing a cap and sunglasses to avoid attention. He needed air, space, clarity. He ended up at a bluff overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed below, indifferent to the turmoil within him. He stood there for a long time, breathing deeply, trying to ground himself in something real, something not built on legacy, lies, or titles. And that's when the grief finally came. Not loud, not theatrical, just quiet tears. A release. He cried for Diana, for the burden she carried, for the loneliness that must have driven her to love someone like Hewitt. He cried for the child he used to be, naive, trusting, believing that family meant unconditional love. He cried for the man he had become, forced to fight for the truth because no one else would. When he returned home hours later, Megan was waiting. She didn't ask questions. She just held him. That night, they didn't speak much. There were no plans made, no calls to lawyers, no strategies. Just silence, rest, processing. But even in the stillness, one thing had changed. The question that had haunted Harry for most of his life had finally been answered. And the truth, though painful, was now his to carry, not as a burden, but as liberation. In the days that followed the arrival of the DNA report, the silence within Harry's Montecito estate became a language of its own. Conversations were few, glances spoke volumes, and the weight of what had been uncovered lingered in every room. Yet outside those walls, the world continued as if nothing had changed. But for Harry, everything had. There was no guidebook for how to respond to a revelation like this. No royal protocol for discovering the man you called father never truly was. No counseling session could prepare him for the surge of emotions, betrayal, grief, confusion, guilt, and above all, rage that followed. And those emotions couldn't remain hidden for long. Something had to break. And it did, within the family and within Harry himself. The first call was to his therapist. Not because he knew what to say, but because he needed someone to witness his unraveling without judgment. The session was raw. He spoke in bursts, jumping from memories of childhood laughter to nights spent wondering why Charles looked at William differently, then back to the report's cold finality. His therapist listened. She didn't interrupt. When he was done, she asked, "What do you want to do with this truth?" Harry had no answer. Not then. But the question lingered. The next fallout was more personal. It happened between Harry and Charles, and it wasn't calm. He initiated the call himself. Megan wasn't in the room. Neither were assistants or aides. Just a direct line between father and son. At first, Charles didn't answer. It went a voicemail. But 20 minutes later, he called back. The moment Harry picked up, he didn't wait for pleasantries. "You knew," Harry said. Charles was quiet for a long moment. Then came a sigh. A heavy, tired sigh, as if the burden of pretending had become too much to carry. "It's not as simple as that," Charles finally said. Harry's grip tightened around the phone. "Yes, it is. I had doubts," Charles said, cautiously. "But there was no proof. And you were my son regardless." "That's not what it felt like," Harry replied sharply. "You treated me like a burden, a problem to be managed, not a son." Charles didn't argue. "Why didn't you tell me?" Harry asked. "Because I didn't want to lose you," Charles answered, his voice quiet. "And because I didn't want the world to know what your mother had done." That was the trigger. The mention of Diana, reduced to an act of betrayal rather than the woman she was, sent Harry over the edge. "She did what she had to do to survive," he said. "You abandoned her. She was alone. And now you want to blame her for the fallout of your choices." Charles didn't respond. But the silence was deafening. "I deserve the truth," Harry continued. "Not the headlines. Not the rumors. The truth. From you." "There's no easy way to tell a child that he might not be your own," Charles said, his voice cracking. "You think I didn't look at you and wonder every single day? Then why pretend?" Harry demanded. "Why not face it?" "Because facing it meant acknowledging that the family was broken, that I failed, that she left because I pushed her away. It meant unraveling everything we worked to protect." Harry was silent, letting the weight of those words settle. For the first time, Charles wasn't hiding behind royal formality. He was admitting weakness, regret, but it didn't erase the years of distance. The coldness, the half-hearted parenting that Harry had always sensed was born of uncertainty, not love. When the call ended, nothing was resolved. No apologies. No reconciliation. Just a shared understanding that something sacred had shattered, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. The fallout didn't stop there. William called next. He had heard through a private channel that Harry was looking into something regarding paternity. At first, William tried to be cautious, diplomatic, but it didn't last. "You're playing with fire," William warned. "This could destroy everything." "It already has," Harry replied. William's tone shifted. "You think this makes you the victim? You're not the only one who lost her. We both did. But I've spent my life trying to hold things together while you've spent yours trying to burn them down." Harry's voice was flat. "Maybe because I was never meant to be part of it in the first place." "That's not true," William snapped. "You are my brother, but not by blood," Harry said. A long pause. "Does that change how you see me?" he asked. William's reply was clipped. "It changes everything." That was the last time they spoke for weeks. Inside the palace, the mood was panic. Courtiers scrambled to control the narrative before it spiraled into public scandal. Internal memos were drafted. Legal consultations began. Contingency plans were discussed, including the worst-case scenario, Harry going public with the DNA results. There were whispers of constitutional implications. If Harry wasn't Charles's biological son, was he still a prince? Did he still deserve security? Would Archie and Lilibet have any royal claim? Legal advisors began poring through historic laws, seeking loopholes or protections. Public relations teams prepared statements that would emphasize family unity, love, and discretion. But behind closed doors, the sentiment was very different. Camilla, now queen, was furious. "He can't do this," she reportedly told Charles. "If he speaks, we lose everything. The crown survives on appearance, not truth." But Charles, for once, wasn't so sure. "He deserves to know who he is," he said. "Even if it costs us." And it might. Elsewhere in the UK, insiders in the press were already beginning to catch the scent of something big. Editors noticed a sudden increase in no comments from Kensington and Clarence House. Photographers were quietly instructed to watch Hewitt's home in Devon. One tabloid even attempted to contact former palace aides for any trace of corroboration. Back in California, Harry and Meghan faced another dilemma: what to do with the truth. Meghan was adamant. "This isn't about vengeance," she said. "It's about closure, about honesty." But Harry wasn't sure. Would going public expose his children? Would it be interpreted as a betrayal of the monarchy or a liberation from it? He had seen what happened when truth became public currency. He had watched how Meghan was dragged through the mud, how Diana was crucified for speaking her truth. He didn't want another circus. But he also didn't want to live another day pretending. That night, Harry sat alone in the garden. The stars were bright, the air cool. He looked up at the sky, remembering nights in Scotland when Diana would point out constellations and whisper stories about destiny. He whispered now, "What would you have me do, Mum?" There was no answer, just the rustle of wind through the leaves. But Harry knew the only way forward was through the truth, not just for him, but for his children, for Diana's memory, for the boy who had once walked behind his mother's coffin in front of a watching world, his face blank, his heart shattered, his questions unspoken. Now, at last, the question had been answered, and the fallout had begun. For a brief moment, Harry thought the truth might stay private, that he could contain it within his inner circle, that the storm could be managed, that a public reckoning could be delayed, maybe even avoided. But he underestimated the one force more relentless than royal protocol: the press. It began with a whisper, a subtle shift in how reporters covered royal stories. Suddenly, headlines that once mocked Harry as the spare became less flippant, more inquisitive. Phrases like "rumors resurface" and "royal paternity question reemerges" began to creep into tabloid coverage. Old photos of James Hewitt were unearthed, reprinted beside Harry's in glossy spreads with glaring titles like "Too Similar to Ignore." Harry noticed the change. So did Meghan. At first, they dismissed it. The media had always speculated, always baited. But this felt different. Less like rumor-mongering and more like targeted probing. Someone knew something. Within days, Harry's worst suspicion was confirmed. A reporter from a major UK tabloid had contacted a friend of Meghan's with a simple, chilling question: "Can you confirm that Harry has received private paternity results related to James Hewitt?" The timing was too precise. Too clean. Someone had leaked. There were only a handful of people with knowledge of the DNA test. The lab, the legal team, a few confidential advisors. Harry's trust had been absolute, but now it was shattered. Panic set in. He immediately convened a private meeting with his legal team and PR advisors. Meghan sat beside him, calm but tense. The questions on the table were urgent. How much did the media know? Had they seen the results? Were they bluffing to force a reaction? And, most importantly, what would happen if the leak went public? One of the lawyers, an American crisis specialist who had dealt with celebrity scandals for decades, was blunt. "You have two choices," she said. "Stay silent and let them define the narrative, or get ahead of it. But either way, once it's out, it's permanent. You don't get a second first impression." Harry was torn. Going public meant dragging the monarchy into an unprecedented scandal. It meant Archie and Lilibet would grow up with the legacy of this revelation echoing around them forever. But staying silent? That meant watching strangers dissect his life, misrepresent his mother, and twist the facts until the lie became louder than the truth again. The choice, in the end, wasn't really a choice. He had lived his entire life in the shadows of decisions made for him. This one had to be his. But the leak couldn't be stopped. The press machine had been activated. Within 48 hours of the first inquiry, headlines exploded across British and American media. DNA bombshell. Has Prince Harry proven Charles isn't his father? Read one outlet. James Hewitt breaks silence on long-standing rumors, claimed another, though the article was built mostly on recycled quotes and speculation. The palace, as expected, refused to comment. Clarence House released a cold, clinical statement: "We do not comment on private family matters." Kensington Palace remained silent. Buckingham Palace ignored the press entirely. The lack of denial only fueled speculation. Across talk shows, podcasts, and online forums, the debate ignited. Some royalists refused to believe it, insisting that the rumor was old, unfounded, and disrespectful. Others latched on with fervor, citing physical similarities between Harry and Hewitt, analyzing timelines, demanding accountability from the monarchy. TV anchors invited body language experts to review clips of Charles with Harry. Psychologists were interviewed on what it meant for Harry's mental health. Social media descended into chaos. Hashtag not his father and hashtag royal DNA trended globally. For Harry and Meghan, the invasion was immediate and brutal. Photographers staked out their Montecito home. Drones buzzed above the property. Friends were hounded for comments. Old acquaintances from Eton and Sandhurst were offered money for childhood anecdotes. Even Doria Ragland, Meghan's mother, received calls from unknown numbers seeking reactions. Meghan, ever the strategist, handled the situation with measured grace. She began drafting a public statement with their team. One that would acknowledge the truth, emphasize the privacy of the matter, and redirect the conversation toward healing rather than scandal. But Harry? He was unraveling. It wasn't just the leak. It was the feeling of being exposed again. He had spent decades trying to protect the most vulnerable parts of himself from the world. Now those parts were being dissected by strangers, judged, mocked, turned into clickbait. The media had always been his enemy. They had hounded Diana until her death. They had demonized Meghan. And now they had taken his truth and weaponized it. But amid the chaos, there were voices of support. Public figures, from psychologists to civil rights advocates, defended Harry's right to know his identity. Mental health professionals wrote op-eds praising his courage. Fans from across the globe flooded his social media with messages of empathy and solidarity. And then something unexpected happened. James Hewitt was spotted outside his countryside home in Devon. For years, he had lived a quiet life, ill health, bankruptcy, and decades of scandal having driven him from the public eye. But now, confronted by a swarm of reporters, he paused. He didn't answer questions. He didn't confirm anything. But he also didn't deny it. That silence, perhaps more than any DNA test, spoke volumes. The press spun it as confirmation. Hewitt doesn't deny paternity rumors was the next wave of headlines. Rumors turned into perceived truths. The world now believed Harry was not Charles's son, and for once, Harry had nothing left to hide. The leak had done its damage, but it had also cleared the path for what came next. A public reckoning. Harry was no longer interested in hiding. The question was no longer about who his father was, but what kind of father, husband, and man he would become in the wake of that truth. The press had forced his hand. Now, he would respond.